very kind introduction. I hope I can live up to a fraction of that. And I would thank all the guests who have honored me with their presence today, despite the rainy weather in New York. I had a hard time even getting here myself, so I'm glad to have all of you here with us. My talk today is entitled On Tempering Genius with Taste, and I use Francois-Joseph Belanger as a vehicle to communicate something. And the first thing that I feel myself obligated to address is why Belanger, what makes him of relevance or of importance to speak about now in 2016 and even beyond. I have two of my own personal reasons. The first one is the fact that Belanger is really an unknown figure. If you haven't heard of his name before, that's probably more likely than if you have. But he's the kind of unknown figure who had preceded some of the most important architects that foresaw modernism. His disciples tended to be more famous than he was, more influential than he was. But he was the kind of figure that resides in the background and made everything after him almost possible even. So he's not really credited as often or as prominently as he should be, in my opinion. And the second reason is that he spoke of architecture not only as a bearer of meaning, which is an often handled discourse, but also as a way to express national identity and ultimately nationalism altogether. These are times where the question of home and nation are coming up quite frequently. They're quite controversial, and many things are being questioned and being put to the test, and it's a good time to look at somebody who had a view that may be relevant still today. I say in the work of Francois-Joseph Belanger, theoretical speculation relative to built work was limited. He really only wrote a small prospectus with his opinions, but really no major books or publications. Architect of the Menu Plaisir to the restored King Louis XVIII, the Menu Plaisir is basically the royal ceremonies and all the royal events, from marriages, deaths, baptisms, coronations, and everything else. Louis XVIII is the younger brother of Louis XVI, and he was reinstated onto the throne at the point of what was known as the Restoration, and it was about 1814. For anyone wondering where Louis XVII happened or where is he was actually Louis XVI's son, and he was quietly murdered, but no one really can account for him. So his uncle, when he was put to the throne, he chose the number 18 just to keep a little place in history for his dead nephew. Belanger examined practical concerns in building. He was interested in the practice rather than in the theory, contrary to visionary dabbles into early modernism, as in the watercolors of Etienne Louis Boulet. I will show some of those in due course and talk about them at the National Archives in Paris, testify to a great body of dreams unrealized. The reason why Boulet's work was unrealized is a whole other thesis, basically. It examines the relationship between the creative mind and authority. He was not in favor, neither before the revolution nor after. Both regarded him with skepticism, and he never had the chance to have anything built of worth, of his really, the important part of his speculation. Even his book, Essai sur l'Art, was not translated until the 20th century. A woman by the name of Helen Rosenau, I think, in the United States translated him. Belanger found in technological innovation the true expression of a civilized nation. Technological innovation and civilization. He ventured into architecture for defining what is instantly and definitely French. So being technologically advanced did not immediately lead to a definition of a nation. He was looking for a je ne sais quoi, or certain trait that sets one kind of work apart from another, and that is what he considered where the Frenchness of his work lies. His royalist sentiments embodied nationalism that was one with his passion for a new industrialized age. So he was at a time loyal to the kingship that was gone, which was already an anachronistic concept at the time, yet he was trying to identify that kind of kingship at the time of industrialization, within which he was determined to securely lodge the restored monarchy. The reason why he's referred to as Le Roi Fauteuil is because he was unable to walk for most of his reign, and part of the difficulty of his movement ended to him not even being crowned. He had a very elaborate carved wood wheelchair with green velvet, upholstery, but still it was a wheelchair nevertheless. Nevertheless, with technology not yet a trend in the arts of the time, Belanger was solitary in expressing a new sense of constitutional monarchy, not through historicity, but industry, in technique and aesthetics. The whole nature of constitutional monarchy was in essence very different from the French monarchy thus far, which was by divine right. The French monarchy was based on a myth that there was a bird that came from heaven carrying an ampoule with a holy ointment with which the king was anointed during the ceremony. And it was a very clearly religious ceremony indicating the connection between kingship and the church and God. And after the Restoration, it was a new model, and they were trying to express it in a new way. In retrospect, Belanger's view was often set in contrast with that of Charles Percier, of Napoleon's design outfit, Percier and Fontaine. Percier and Fontaine Percier was in a way somebody who was influenced by Belanger, but their style is hailed by most as the last unique style, the last living style. And as recently as the 1990s, maybe, Versace tried to base his last collection before his passing on the Empire style. And in my opinion, his failure to do so goes to the fact that their style was very serendipitous. It didn't really have much rules or regulations to it. It was basically based on their own sense of what is beautiful, which is one of the reasons why their style is copied, but it never really survived on its own, because it's quite difficult to come up with new ideas. People just use their motifs as they left them behind. In that, Belanger's was antithetic and revolutionary. Percier and Fontaine aimed generally to harmonize with the context, while Belanger considered leaving a statement to be a function of being as much in contrast with it as possible. While Percier's designs were eclectic confections serendipitously amalgamated into an inextricably harmonious whole with the existing context, which is this. And when you see any composition like that by Percier and Fontaine, you're often left wondering where is the permanent structure and where is their intervention, because they intertwine them with such unique taste that becomes difficult to separate the two, except most of the work that was done for ceremonies tended to be in carton and paper and fabric and canvas and really light materials that could be dismantled eventually. And so, in contrast to Percier and Fontaine's widely celebrated yet short-lived empire style, Belanger's intuitive response to context was one of contrast, probably comparable as a work of intuition than historicist decorum, yet notably industrial of character and certainly heavy-handed. His work never was as graceful and as integrated as something by Percier and Fontaine was. It tends to be heavy-handed, and so was his disciple Hittorf's after him. Some of Hittorf's later directions, such as polychromy, is already present in this fireplace detail with the combination of the dark marble and gilding. And then when he wants to create something that intends to work as a centralized piece, it also remains somewhat on the naive and the heavy-handed side when considered against Percier's airy confections. Belanger, these are some plates from Percier and Fontaine's books. The way they wrote and illustrated their books was almost like a handbook. So you actually can take these motifs just the way they are and apply them somewhere. They don't require scaling, or they're not set in perspective. They're not built and photographed. They're literally in elevations and plans. So they could be taken as they are and then implemented to whichever design you want. And the majority of them are actually in line work. So you can see the chair in front and side elevations, etc., and it goes like that. Belanger was concerned with genius as design intuition. He regarded genius as some kind of an unfettered spark of insanity almost that had to be tamed or tempered somehow, which is where the idea of temperance is coming into play here. A determinant of individual creativity alongside taste, and reason. Reason as the ultimate human faculty or ability to be able to process, well, we call it information now, but it was impulses. And taste is what governs or holds back the flight of fancy or of genius. And he says, genius without taste, wrote Belanger, is more dangerous for an artist than taste without genius. Unquote. With no taste to temper creativity, genius may reach extremes of ability. Where danger lay in forces running unfettered, ungoverned, and unrefined. In other words, and that's basically the whole thesis in a nutshell, Belanger's discourse on taste and genius was at once on government and on temperance. So, and this is an area of personal interest of mine, which is the relevance of aesthetics or aesthetic thinking, including architecture and all the arts, to the concept of government and identity. They are much more related than one hears in the daily discourse, and they are much more intrinsic to one another. Belanger found meaning in technology, revolting against purely imitative grounds for aesthetic composition, and argued that innovative methods of iron construction essentially reflect national character and sensibilities, that you can find that national identity in the work of art, even if one did not know much about the background of the work they're looking at. In a letter addressed to the Minister of Interior Affairs, Belanger wrote about iron construction in European and American monuments as visual embodiment of lasting national glory. He was very much interested in the American model and the American example, but he still didn't want to prostrate his approach too much to that, and he was a little bit sensitive about the English example, and as we will see in a second, as found in the durability and firmness of iron, affording a new host of forms in design, without naming such forms. Lightness is another quality of iron relative to masonry, favorably mentioned in structural soundness rather than beauty. Coupled with solidity, lightness is a quality of newly found material of great potential. With one unpublished prospectus on taste, Belanger, more a critic than a theorist, his critique marginal relative to most of his contemporaries, was in his buildings, set against contemporary work as context. So if we want to consider his work some kind of a commentary, it's commentary on what? Basically on what was being done at the time. In his introduction to the works of architect Nicolas Le Camus de Mézières, Robin Middleton established that the genius of architecture was at the foundation of Étienne Louis Boulet's Architecture sur l'art, which is architecture essay on art, wherein Boulet explored a relation of architectural space and emotional response. Boulet is quite a complex issue. I don't want to elaborate on him too much, but he is definitely worth anybody's time. And he received much attention in recent years compared to the kind of neglect he suffered. In a nutshell, the Ancien Régime, before the revolution, considered him to have been some kind of a rebel because he wasn't working in Baroque and certainly not in Rococo. His Platonic forms and simple, clean lines were against the general ruling taste, and that in itself was a distasteful statement to make. When the revolution happened, the revolution regarded him again with suspicion, thinking that he stole from the poor to give to the rich, because he took the simplicity of the house of the poor and attributed to government buildings and major buildings. So in both ends, he was displeasing. He was not really met with much appreciation. But that doesn't undermine, of course, the lasting quality of his work. I perceived that if any means existed of putting the ideas that preoccupied me into effect, that's Belanger, it must lie in the way light was filtered into the temple. The idea of light, by the way, I'm sorry, I meant Boulet. The idea of light in Boulet's work was intended to stand for divine presence, for the presence of God somehow. So many of his drawings showed really buildings so large as to preclude their construction, and then yet some shadow is cast on top of them from somewhere, but he doesn't show the source of shadow. So that shadow or that extreme light almost raining upon the building is an indication of the divine presence, and that was his idea essentially. That is how I reasoned. It is light that produces impressions, which arouse in us various contradictory sensations, depending on whether they are brilliant or somber. If I could manage to diffuse in my temple magnificent light effects, I would fill the onlooker with joy. But if, on the contrary, my temple had only somber effects, I would fill him with sadness. And that's the idea how that kind of space would leave a certain impression upon the onlooker. When the Minister of Interior had decided in 1805 to reconstruct the cupola of the granary, this is one last sheet from Boulay. This is actually cenotaphs, the Newton's cenotaph. A cenotaph is a tomb where the person is not buried. It's like a memorial. And he really did something that's, this is a human scale, so you know how big it is. These little figures are the people. So you can imagine what the size of this thing is. And it works on the principle that during daytime, there are holes in the shell. And when you're inside, in the darkness, it shines like stars. And at night, he would have a central piece of flame that would work as the sun and shine into. It's a cosmological reference in architecture that he was trying to do. So when the Minister of Interior wanted to replace the dome on the Al-Douri, which is a house of grinding wheat, and the original dome was built in wood, Belanger made a proposal for a cast iron dome, blaming wood for the fire that actually ate the former dome, and making a new argument, as we see in a second, about the new cast iron structure. He called upon the Conseil des Travaux to offer advice on the method of construction most appropriate in terms of three parameters: solidity, cost, and decoration or ornament. Belanger wrote, "It is necessary that we build monuments of strong and enduring materials, for monuments are constituents of the glory of the nations to which they belong, embellish and strengthen." He was commissioned to the project of the Al-Douri, Belanger, one of two he did during the Empire. His proposal for replacing the cupola that Nicolas Le Camus de Mézières he had built earlier on the site of the old Hôtel de Soissons, that was the house of residence of Catherine de Medici, best exemplified Belanger's work as practical commentary. The original cupola had, as we said, burnt down. It was designed by Philibert Delorme, architect of Henry II, finished in 1783 and burnt in 1802. A fate that Belanger, as we said, attributed to the material having been wood and thus unsuitable, even though endurance was not Belanger's only consideration in proposing a replacement in iron of the wooden cupola. His interest was beyond really the idea of duration. He argued for duration because he wanted to sell the idea to the ministry, basically. So he's saying, I'm building something that's going to last longer, but that's not the real reason. He presented structural innovation, and that's the real reason, as expression of national loyalty, as a measure of superiority over the rest of Europe, particularly Britain. Britain had preceded France in the Industrial Revolution, but Belanger's comment was that the English can handle technology and they can build technologically advanced monuments, but they don't have the test that we, the French, have. And he wanted to apply that taste, that certain finesse or certain spirit that would characterize French technology as tasteful as well, not only successful and structurally. Belanger recognized the precedence of British efforts in iron construction in replacement of woodwork and stonework to those of the French. Yet his interpretation reflected a principled nationalist angle, attributing that precedence to the scarcity of timber and stone in England. So they had to go for iron because they don't have enough wood, is what he said. He maintained that the French had for long mastered proportion in fields of construction, experimenting with forms in combination that the British craftsmen dare not attempt to explore. So he not only considers the French person to be more tasteful, but actually more courageous. So construction, in his case, is an act of courage. Belanger's awareness of the growing fascination with iron construction throughout Europe and America was thorough enough for him to know that, although the novelty of it was quickly wearing off, room was ample for innovation of style and mastery of proportion. In matters of proportion, Belanger credits the French when given the opportunity and freedom to exercise their good taste and keen sense of style. This is a proposal for the dome, structure and exterior. Elegance of proportion to Belanger was no exception to lightness. It was a property of the new construction material with its distinct character of structure and form. He never lost faith in architecture as the means of technological and political representation. However, he made no reference to taste or cultural identity through architectural construction. His allusion to proportion in iron was in admiration of the French perfecting proportioning iron construction as an act of courage. He wrote, "I consider architecture a scientific art, with maxims not unlike music." And the analogy between architecture and music is very frequent. There's an entire literature talking about that, even to the point of calling architecture frozen music. But I think that we have to learn them in order to distance ourselves therefrom with taste and intelligence. Taste is not arbitrary. It is a point of focus in all nations, keeping the specifics of character of craftsmen, place, and time. It is Belanger's conviction to craft as character that drove his commitment to technological innovation as embodiment of national identity. And just to bring the story to a close, so you know what happened with Belanger eventually, within a year thereafter, Francois-Joseph Belanger, out of favor since the French Revolution and under Napoleon's empire, was to regain significance when in turn restored to post under the Restoration. So then when the Bourbons were brought back to the throne, he was put back again as architecte des menus plaisirs, or the architect of the royal ceremonies. Much effort in early days of Restoration was invested in recovering the Gothic splendor of the very Christian king, le roi très chrétien, in its pre-Napoleonic digression, free of possible of antique paganism. Belanger seemed most suited for the job, yet having long been the architect of the Bourbon house. Yet with few words on record and fewer buildings standing besides royal ceremonies, Belanger toiled to be regarded as more than a royal decorator. Whenever possible, he departed from the usual and customary, delving into obscure historic reference, at once innovative and questionable, for the royal ceremonies back in full swing upon the Restoration. Belanger may be remembered as an architect of the authority, a decorator for power, and a master of craft, making a visual case for sovereignty without popular support. However, interwoven with deftly deposited familiar symbols were esoteric references, classical icons, even pagan nods, as experimental as they were clumsy and questionable, all amounting to work that was often too readily dismissed as transitional and confused, especially when it was preceded with the unmatched elegance of Persien and Fontaine's eclecticism and ensued with the long, well-established career of Jacques-Ignace Etorf, or Jacob Ignace Etorf, depending on how you want to say it, because he was from the Alsace and he spent half of his life being German and half of it being French. He wanted to be French, but it wasn't so easy for him to get the citizenship, so he had to live kind of a dual life. Yet Belanger might just be the one character teetering on obscurity, whose career and surviving historic turbulence was a bridge anticipating, even making possible, the modernity of the following generation of architects. Again, he may have been not known, but he was really essential for what was yet to follow. His work testified to the crisis of identity in times of transition, when politics eroded values, religion divided and conquered, and industry failed to brighten up grim future. Creativity is an open expanse where irate extremism is tempered by taste, and genius blossoms unfettered by the selfishness, but guided by reason and by wisdom. Thank you.